Welcome to our channel. Today, I will tell you about a shocking case, and you won't believe its details. A wife who appeared gentle on the outside was actually a sex addict, obsessed with sexual satisfaction. Since her husband couldn't fulfill her desires, she secretly had an affair with his friend, and then she killed her husband. Even more astonishing, she continued to have sex with her husband's best friend right next to her husband's body. Let's dive into the story. In the quiet suburbs of Phoenix, Arizona, Ethan and Madison Parker lived what appeared to be the ideal life. Their home was a modern, elegant two-story house nestled among perfectly manicured lawns and neat tree-lined streets. From the outside, their life seemed picturesque. Ethan, a 35-year-old accountant, had built a successful career, providing stability and comfort. Inside their home, though, cracks were beginning to form. Ethan, despite being kind, reliable, and hardworking, was plagued by a problem he couldn't fix: impotence. This struggle had slowly eaten away at the intimacy in their marriage, leaving a void that neither of them wanted to confront openly. Madison, 32, was stunning. Her beauty radiated from every corner of the house they shared. Outwardly, she played the role of the devoted wife, attending social functions, smiling for pictures, and keeping up appearances. But beneath the surface, she was growing increasingly frustrated. Her physical desires were unmet, and emotional neglect began to settle in like an unwelcome guest. Though Ethan remained the loving husband, his inability to connect with her on a deeper level left Madison feeling isolated and unfulfilled. Into this fragile balance stepped David Carter, Ethan's best friend and a gym trainer. At 33, David was the epitome of physical fitness: strong, confident, and charismatic. He frequented the Parker household, often joining them for dinners or casual gatherings. Ethan trusted him completely, never once suspecting the chemistry building between his wife and his closest friend. As David's visits became more frequent, subtle glances and lingering touches between him and Madison began to reveal an unspoken tension. Madison's growing attraction to David simmered beneath the surface, a dangerous secret threatening to unravel the perfect facade they had all built. The affair between Madison and David began on a quiet evening that should have been like any other. Ethan was away on a business trip, leaving Madison alone in their spacious house, where the silence amplified her growing dissatisfaction. David, as he often did, dropped by for dinner. The two sat at the dining table, a bottle of wine between them, the conversation flowing effortlessly. With each glass, the tension between them thickened, the boundaries that once existed crumbling under the weight of their mutual desire. The flicker of candlelight danced in Madison's eyes as she watched David, her frustration with Ethan's absence and their fading intimacy surging to the surface. It didn't take long before words gave way to something more. A stolen glance became a lingering touch, and before Madison could second-guess herself, they were kissing, first tentatively, then with the urgency of long-suppressed emotions. The kiss, ignited by months of unspoken attraction, unleashed something primal between them. That night, in the house Ethan had built, Madison and David crossed a line they could never uncross. The affair had begun, and with it came a rush of adrenaline that neither of them could resist. In the days that followed, their secret meetings became frequent. Madison would find excuses to see David while Ethan was at work, and they began to take risks that would have seemed unthinkable before. They would meet in the very house Madison shared with Ethan, engaging in heated encounters in the very bed where she and Ethan once slept. The thrill of their deception seemed to make the danger more intoxicating. Madison, torn between guilt and desire, found ways to justify her actions. She told herself that it was Ethan's fault. His impotence had created this distance. His inability to satisfy her was driving her to seek pleasure elsewhere. David, always quick with reassurance, played into this narrative, telling her that what they shared was natural, that she deserved to be happy. He made her feel wanted in a way Ethan never could, and Madison allowed herself to believe that the affair wasn't just inevitable, it was essential to her happiness. Together, they plunged deeper into their secret, unaware that every step they took was bringing them closer to a disastrous end. Ethan Parker had always prided himself on being a trusting husband, but recently, subtle shifts in Madison's behavior began to gnaw at him. It started with the late-night phone calls. Madison would step out of the room to take them, her voice dropping to a whisper that sent a pang of unease through Ethan. He told himself it was work or perhaps one of her friends needing advice. But the calls became more frequent, and Madison's phone was never far from her hand, as if she were waiting for something or someone. Ethan's mind, already stretched thin by stress at work, couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her trips to the gym also increased in frequency. Madison had always been fitness conscious, but now it seemed like she spent more time there than ever. She would come home later than usual, flushed and energized in a way that had nothing to do with exercise. When Ethan questioned her, she smiled and brushed it off, claiming she needed the extra workouts to relieve stress. But Ethan couldn't help but notice how often David's name came up in casual conversation, how she spoke of him with a lightness that felt too familiar. One night, as Ethan lay awake in bed, he overheard a conversation between Madison and David. She was speaking in hushed tones, her words barely audible through the walls. "You know I can talk now," she whispered. Ethan's stomach twisted, suspicion hardening into something darker. Unable to sleep, he decided to investigate. The next day, he checked her phone when she was in the shower, but there was nothing incriminating, no messages from David, no evidence of an affair. Yet, instead of feeling relieved, Ethan felt his paranoia grow stronger. The absence of proof only made him more certain something was being hidden. As days turned into weeks, Ethan's suspicions became all-consuming. He started sleeping less, his mind racing with thoughts of Madison and David. His appetite waned, and his work performance began to suffer. Colleagues noticed his distracted demeanor, his sudden inability to focus. Ethan tried to dismiss it as work stress, but deep down, he knew the real cause. His marriage, once a source of stability, was now a constant source of anxiety. The more he tried to push the thoughts away, the more they returned, tormenting him in every waking moment. His health declined, and with it, the foundation of trust that had once held his life together crumbled, leaving him lost in a haze of suspicion and dread. Ethan could no longer bear the weight of his suspicions. The restless nights, the gnawing paranoia, and the constant doubts had pushed him to the edge. On a seemingly ordinary afternoon, he decided to come home early from work, hoping to catch Madison off guard. As he approached the front door, his heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing with 1,000 possible explanations for the unease that had taken hold of his life. He entered the house quietly, the familiar scent of home filling the air, but something was different. The sound of hushed voices and muffled laughter drifted from the bedroom upstairs. His pulse quickened. Ethan crept up the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The noise grew louder, and when he reached the door, the unmistakable sound of movement behind it confirmed his worst fears. Without thinking, he pushed the door open with a force that sent it slamming against the wall. His eyes widened in horror as he saw Madison and David tangled in the bedsheets, their shocked faces turning toward him. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The betrayal that had haunted Ethan's mind for weeks was now a living nightmare, playing out in front of him. The room filled with an unbearable tension as the three stood there, locked in a silent confrontation. Then, in a fit of uncontrollable rage, Ethan lunged at David, his fist swinging wildly. He struck David across the face, sending him crashing into the nightstand. The adrenaline coursing through Ethan's veins made him blind to reason. All he saw was red: his wife's infidelity, his best friend's betrayal. David, dazed and struggling to defend himself, tried to push Ethan off, but Ethan's fury was unstoppable. He grabbed David by the collar, shouting incoherently, his voice hoarse with anger. Madison screamed, pleading for them to stop, but her words fell on deaf ears. In the chaos, Madison frantically searched for something to break up the fight, her eyes landing on a heavy lamp on the bedside table. Without thinking, she grabbed it and swung it with all her strength. The sound of the impact was sickening. The lamp struck Ethan on the side of his head, and for a moment, he stood still, his body swaying as if in disbelief. Then, he collapsed to the floor, motionless. Blood began to pool beneath him, the rich red staining the bedroom carpet. Madison stood frozen, the lamp still in her hands, unable to comprehend what had just happened. David scrambled to his feet, his face pale with shock as he stared down at Ethan's lifeless body. Neither of them spoke. The gravity of what they had done settled over the room like a suffocating weight. Ethan, the man Madison had once loved, lay dead at their feet. The horror of their actions hit them like a tidal wave, but there was no going back. The betrayal that had begun in secrecy had now ended in irreversible tragedy. Madison and David stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, staring at Ethan's lifeless body. The gravity of what they had done weighed down on them, but panic quickly took over. They knew there was no turning back now, they had to act fast. David, his mind racing, was the first to speak. "We need to make this look like an accident or a suicide." His voice was low and urgent. Madison, still in shock, nodded numbly, the lamp slipping from her trembling hands. They hurriedly began devising a plan. Ethan's recent stress at work gave them the perfect angle as suicide stage to look like he had taken his own life due to overwhelming financial troubles. Madison, barely able to control her shaking fingers, grabbed a piece of paper from the drawer. Together, they crafted a suicide note. The words felt hollow and foreign as she wrote them. "I can't take the pressure anymore. The business is failing, and I can't bear to drag you both down with me. Forgive me." It was a cruel fabrication, but in the heat of the moment, it was their only option. Next came the cleanup. David wiped his fingerprints from the heavy lamp, which now had traces of blood smeared across its surface. Madison, swallowing the rising bile in her throat, helped remove any signs of struggle. They rearranged the furniture, tidied the disheveled bed, and ensured there was nothing that could indicate a fight had taken place. They carefully positioned Ethan's body, making it look like he had fallen after a failed attempt to end his life. Every detail had to be perfect. Once the scene was set, they both stepped back, breathing heavily, their hearts pounding. For a brief moment, a sickening sense of relief washed over them. The room was quiet again, and the staged scene looked convincing enough. They exchanged a glance, thinking they had covered their tracks, believing they had hidden the truth. But underneath that fleeting calm, the dread of what they had done lurked, ready to unravel their false sense of security. The following morning, the quiet suburban street was shattered by the piercing sound of sirens. It was the neighbor, Mrs. Evans, who had first found Ethan's body. After Madison discovered him and ran screaming into the street, Mrs. Evans had rushed over and, horrified by the scene, immediately called the police. Now, as officers cordoned off the house and investigators flooded the scene, Madison stood outside, playing the role of a devastated widow. Her tear-streaked face, trembling hands, and incoherent sobs painted the picture of a woman whose world had crumbled overnight. When Detective Sarah Collins arrived, she was greeted by a carefully staged scene. Madison, through choked words, explained that Ethan had been struggling with financial pressures. He was overwhelmed, she said, her voice shaking. The business wasn't doing well. I didn't know it was this bad. She clung to the narrative they had fabricated, painting Ethan as a man who had succumbed to the weight of his responsibilities. David, standing nearby, tried to maintain a calm exterior, offering his own condolences as Ethan's best friend. But Collins, seasoned and sharp, sensed something was off. As the forensic team combed through the scene, they began to uncover several inconsistencies. The blood splatter didn't align with the story of a self-inflicted head wound. The angle of the injury was strange, as if the blow had come from an external source. Something wasn't adding up. More troubling were Ethan's financial records, which showed no signs of distress. The business was stable, and there was no indication that he had been in any sort of financial trouble. Collins began to wonder if this was more than just a tragic suicide. Madison's alibi, while emotionally convincing, began to unravel under Collins' scrutiny. As Collins interviewed her, Madison struggled to maintain her composure under more direct questioning. Her responses became less cohesive, and her lack of true emotional depth during certain moments raised red flags. The tears seemed rehearsed, her grief exaggerated at times, and her story began to sound too rehearsed. David, standing by, was no better. He seemed nervous, his eyes darting between Madison and Collins, his hands fidgeting as he spoke. When asked about his frequent presence at the house, David stammered, claiming it was all innocent, just visiting an old friend. But Collins could see through the cracks in his calm facade. Then, a break came in the form of surveillance footage from a neighbor's security camera. Collins and her team discovered that David had been at the house more often than he had initially let on, and always when Ethan was away. It was too much of a coincidence. Collins' instincts were screaming that this wasn't just an unfortunate suicide, it was something much darker. The more Collins pressed, the more Madison and David's stories began to diverge. Details didn't align, where they were at certain times, how Madison had found Ethan, and David's presence on the night of his death. What began as a carefully constructed alibi was now beginning to crumble. The air of guilt hung thick between Madison and David, and Collins was determined to unravel the truth, no matter how carefully they had tried to bury it. As the investigation deepened, Detective Sarah Collins and her team began uncovering a trail of secrets that Madison and David had tried to bury. Suspicion had already clouded the air, but it was the discovery of incriminating phone records, text messages, and emails that cemented the truth. With a search warrant granted, the detectives combed through Madison and David's digital lives, unearthing a torrid affair that had been going on for months. Late-night texts, filled with passion and hidden meetings, painted a damning picture of their betrayal. The messages weren't just flirtatious, they revealed a growing attachment between the two, a relationship that had crossed every boundary of trust Ethan once believed in. The deeper Collins dug, the more damning the evidence became. In one particularly explicit exchange, the two lovers discussed their fear of being caught. Madison had confessed to David that Ethan was starting to get suspicious, and they spoke of how to handle the situation if it ever escalated. Though they hadn't explicitly planned Ethan's death, their conversations hinted at a dangerous readiness to deal with him if things ever became too complicated. It was enough to suggest that Madison and David were prepared for the worst if Ethan found out. But the final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source, a neighbor who had overheard a heated argument the night Ethan died. The neighbor, Mrs. Evans, recounted hearing raised voices, Ethan's angry shouts, and what sounded like a scuffle. She had thought about checking in, but the noise subsided, and she brushed it off as a domestic dispute. Her testimony directly contradicted Madison's story of finding Ethan's body alone and suggested that a violent confrontation had taken place. The combination of the neighbor's testimony, the explicit messages between Madison and David, and the inconsistencies in their alibi led Collins to conclude that Ethan had not taken his own life. Instead, he had confronted the two in the midst of their affair, a confrontation that turned deadly. The lovers, in their desperate attempt to cover their tracks, had failed to account for the one thing that would expose them completely: their own digital fingerprints. The noose was tightening, and Madison and David's web of lies was beginning to unravel faster than they could stop it. The arrest of Madison and David sent shockwaves through the quiet suburb and quickly became the subject of national headlines. The once idyllic life of Ethan Parker had unraveled into a web of deceit, betrayal, and murder, and the salacious details of the affair and the brutal killing captivated the media. Madison and David were taken into custody and charged with second-degree murder. Cameras flashed as they were led away in handcuffs, their carefully constructed lives now exposed to the world. As the trial began, the courtroom was packed with reporters, eager to document every sordid detail. Madison's defense team attempted to paint her as a victim of emotional neglect, arguing that her desperation to escape a loveless and sexually unfulfilling marriage had driven her to make tragic decisions. They claimed that she had been manipulated by David, who played on her vulnerabilities. Madison sat on the stand, her face pale, tearfully recounting how she had felt trapped in a marriage devoid of intimacy and how David had been her only source of comfort. But the prosecution was relentless. They focused on the cold, calculated actions Madison had taken after Ethan's death, the staging of the suicide, the fabricated note, and her chilling ability to continue with her affair in the immediate aftermath of her husband's murder. David, meanwhile, was portrayed as the instigator, a man who had taken advantage of his position as Ethan's trusted friend to manipulate both Ethan and Madison for his own gain. The prosecution highlighted how his frequent visits to the Parker home had provided him ample opportunity to nurture the affair and ultimately conspire with Madison. Friends of the couple were called to the stand, testifying to the noticeable change in Madison's behavior after meeting David. They described her as once devoted to Ethan but increasingly distant and secretive as her relationship with David deepened. The forensic evidence further solidified the prosecution's case. Blood splatter patterns inconsistent with the staged suicide, and a blatant attempt to cover up the crime left no room for doubt. The explicit text messages and emails between Madison and David were the final nail in the coffin. After days of deliberation, the jury returned their verdict. Both Madison and David were found guilty. Madison, being the direct perpetrator of Ethan's death, received a heavier sentence, 25 years to life in prison. David, convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, was sentenced to 20 years. The courtroom was silent as the sentences were read, the weight of their actions finally sinking in. The trial, and the devastating consequences of their affair, had reached its inevitable conclusion. As the judge delivered the sentences, the weight of their actions finally settled over Madison and David. Madison, sentenced to 25 years to life, and David, receiving 20 years, sat motionless as the reality of their fate sank in. The courtroom, once buzzing with scandalous details, now felt heavy with silence. Led away in handcuffs, their faces were pale, devoid of the fire and passion that had driven them to such a tragic end. There was no triumph, no satisfaction, only regret. As Madison was escorted through the corridors, her mind drifted back to the life she had destroyed. She had traded love, security, and a stable future for fleeting moments of lust and desire. What had once seemed thrilling now felt hollow. There was no solace in what she had done, only a gnawing emptiness. She realized too late that her choices had shattered not only her own life but the lives of everyone around her. At Ethan's funeral, his grieving family and friends gathered to say their final goodbyes. The air was thick with sorrow, as those who loved him tried to make sense of the senseless. The life they had once known was gone, lost to betrayal, leaving behind only the fragments of what could have been. The story of Madison and David serves as a stark reminder of the destructive power of infidelity, jealousy, and greed. What began as a pursuit of personal satisfaction spiraled into an irreversible tragedy, leaving lives shattered in its wake. The choices they made, driven by selfish desires, created wounds that could never heal. No one emerged unscathed from their betrayal, and in the end, the allure of forbidden passion led to nothing but despair. As the dust settled, one truth became painfully clear. In the end, betrayal leaves no victors, only casualties.